Shilpi Kapoor, Accessibility, the People First Approach.
Okay, so I guess we got our slides up there. So good morning, everyone. I think my attire shows I'm not from this country. So as you can see, I'm wearing a sari. Actually, a lovely, what we call an aubergine color in India with green, which is quite vibrant as far as I see. I've always found that working in Barrier Break or starting this company, I've had to go to different parts of the world. I work in about 14 different countries around the world. And what's interesting is I've always wanted to figure out how do I take India along with me. And that's why you see me here in a sari today. But today what I'm going to talk to you about is thinking accessibility, the people's first approach. So I think before I start from there, I'm going to tell you about why I do what I do. It's a very short story. So 93 is the first time that I got into an internet chat room. And it feels like a lifetime ago. But that's really when I learned something called hacking. As a young person out of college, it was the most interesting thing that I could think of. And interestingly, I got a job with an American firm working out of India who wanted me to look after security of their servers in the India time zone. And who wouldn't want an opportunity like that at 23 or 24? So I said, fabulous, So they gave me an internship, they gave me a job, and I worked with this company for about 2 years of my life. I think everything I learned about hacking was self-taught. Actually, also true to accessibility. Everything I learned about accessibility is self-taught, which I'm sure is true to a lot of you out here, because we do not have curriculum out there that is there for us in this space. So anyway, coming back to my story. So for about 2 years of working with this organization, the person who actually hired me in that job one day was on the same shift as I was. I caught the hacker and he didn't. We used to work in Max in 93. And it was amazing that this is somebody who had taught me everything that he knew. It was like somebody who was an elder in the community. We talk about elders in the accessibility space today. And what was really amazing was when I asked him, I said, what happened? How come I beat you to the game today? He turned around and he told me, he says, you don't know this about me, but I met with an accident in my life. I'm paralyzed neck down. For 2 years you've known me, I've been paralyzed. I use a sip and puff device. It's called an assistive technology. And that was it. For me, what was the biggest shock was, at that time, being naive, being young, what I never realized was that for me, I had a lot of biases. One of the biases was somebody who was paralyzed couldn't be fast. Somebody who was paralyzed couldn't use technology. Somebody who was paralyzed couldn't be as good as I could be. I think he actually shattered every one of those biases that day. So I went on from there to starting to think about what I wanted to do with my life. And since he knew me for 2 years, he turned around and told me, he said, Shilpi, why not technology for people with disabilities? Interestingly, this is the time that Windows 95 came out, right? Windows 95 was the first time we saw some real simple accessibility features. I can see Andrew nodding his head out here. I think we were, all of us at some point, one of the first few people who started off. So what was really interesting was when we saw that, what I got intrigued was, I think what is something which is the bane of accessibility today, was people with visual impairment. Right? And the screen reader really excited me. And I said, oh my God, how do visually impaired people use computers? Right? I say it's the bane of our existence today because very often other groups of people are actually ignored because of screen reader users. And that's why I sometimes say that statement. Not to be offensive to the visually impaired or the blind, but it's just that the way the whole accessibility world has taken on to that tool, it sometimes makes you sit back and say, have we forgotten other people? Or other groups of people that we need to consider. So anyway, I went from there to starting the first ever computer training center in India for the visually impaired. Very soon realized I didn't want to be a charity, and thus came to be born what is today called Barrier Break. So Barrier Break is an accessibility consulting firm. The reason I told you this story was because I'm sure each and every one of you in this room has a story very similar to mine. some not as dramatic as mine, but it might be because you had somebody who was a senior who got you onto a project, somebody who suddenly become passionate about something which actually might not correlate with their life at all, but has become their life. So I think it's really important for all of us to understand that most of us who work within accessibility work because we really have a passion for that. So how many of you have now turned over? When you started off with the first project on accessibility, you actually looked at it and said, what are all of these people talking about? Why do I need to take care of this user group? And today you're on the other side and you feel that, oh my God, why isn't this accessible? You walk around the streets of Sydney and say, why isn't this accessible? Or you open a web app and say, why isn't this accessible? So how many of you in that category of people who've turned over? I am. Fabulous. So that's a quite large number of us. But I yet see that there are some who are not converted. So I think we have some way to go, I guess, in that. So I guess that is why I do what I do. Okay, can we go to the next slide, which is my clicker here? Fabulous. So I think the stats are very obvious, 1 billion people worldwide. I generally don't talk country statistics. I come from a country where if I didn't do accessibility worldwide, India wouldn't have accessibility, right? We have a mandate, we have a law, very much like yours, but we don't have implementation, right? So I'm not sure about Australia as much, but I can tell you for a fact that if Netflix became accessible because of the US market, the same users in the Australian market or the Indian market will also have the same access, right? That's why it's a global world. So I think the key is not to really look at the statistics about a particular country, but to look at the global statistics when it comes to accessibility, because we're such a fragmented group. We are always outliers. Earlier we were talking about AI and the data set, and we're always a data set that doesn't seem to exist within the commercial space. But we are a group of 1 billion people worldwide. So how is it that we yet don't count? And how is it that we yet outliers within a data set? But the reality of it is that is so true, we yet are, right? We yet have the same challenges of getting ourselves included. So if we don't talk the larger number, we are yet going to be an outlier database because we'll end up being in the 30 million, the 20 million, whatever are those categories. And within the different diverse groups, we become even a smaller component. Yesterday, we heard Colin talk about there were 30,000 deaf people in this country, right? When you look at that number, the numbers suddenly start to give us a reality check when it comes to commercial conversations. But when we look at the larger number of the deaf population worldwide, we see a very different picture, right? So at least for me, I've always looked at the global number, and that's what's excited me. So here's a very simple definition of accessibility, right? It's one of those that I always feel is ignored. So I've actually underlined some of the words and highlighted some, and I'm going to read them out with a very similar pause. So accessibility is allowing people to use anything, product or service in the way they want, using the way they want to, using the tools they want to. It's about choice, very often forgotten. It always lands up being, we developed this, we tested this with this tool, this has been tested with JAWS 17, this has been tested with NVDA. But what we need to realize is it's really about the people. It's not about the tool. It's not about what it's tested with, it's about who's using those systems, who are using those solutions. It's not only about a web app or a mobile app, it's also about the services being provided around it. It's also about the simple things like this clicker and how accessible is that. So the challenge for us is really not to forget the people. Interestingly, most of us within the accessibility space, and me included, very often revert to the concept of the thing, the product, or the service, and we ignore the people, right? So it's now time to bring the people back into the conversation, and I'm hoping to do that with you today. So let's define people. Who'd like to help me? So which are the different groups out here? Anybody? Just raise a hand and yell out. We won't have the mic go around. Anybody that identifies as human. So we are the evolved group, right? And that's why we've reached that understanding. But if we weren't so evolved, how would we define people? Anybody? Male, female, young, old, Asian, Indian, Aussie, tall, short, deaf, hearing, visually impaired, blind, all different kinds of groups define people. But interestingly, in our world of accessibility, there are certain terms that have come across in the world. And these are the terms that in the accessibility world have got documented within different standards, acts, laws around the world. So I have a table out here which actually has some of the terms used by two very different documents in the world on accessibility. So how many of you have heard of EN 301549? Fabulous, right? So that is the European standard today, and that is what is, going to be followed by Europe. And I do hear that there's some chatter that Australia is also going to be looking at EN 301549, and I see, right, fabulous. So we've got EN 301549, and then we've got WCAG on the other side, right, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, which is a guideline which we need to conform to, which most of us test towards. Now, the words that are used within these two documents are very similar, but they're not identical. And we here talk about that accessibility needs to be harmonized globally so that all of us can work towards the same standards so that people with disabilities worldwide can get the same equal access. But yet, there is a slight difference in the terminology used between these two, right? So the EN 301549 refers to it as without vision, whereas WCAG often refers to it as blind people or visually impaired, right? Without vision, blind people or visually impaired. Limited vision as per EN 301549, low vision or visually impaired as per WCAG. Without perception of color, colorblind or visually impaired, right? Without hearing, deaf people. Limited hearing, hearing impaired. Without vocal capabilities, speech impaired. With limited manipulation or strength, mobility impaired. Limited cognitive abilities, cognitively or learning impaired. The need for minimized photosensitive seizure triggers, epilepsy. How many of you had ever seen these terminologies like this? Anybody? Fabulous. We've got a couple of people who've looked at it. But this, when you look at this, there are so many similarities, yet so many differences between the way the different user groups are talked about, right? And these are the user groups that we all really need to talk about. It doesn't matter whether we refer to it as blind people or without vision. It's the intent of what we want to deliver within these groups. A lot of these groups, and I think somebody yesterday mentioned the Microsoft Inclusive Design Kit, and there is the spectrum that they talk about. And if you can see, the spectrum is here. So when you talk about without vision and limited vision, you've got a spectrum in the middle. And there are so many different medical conditions within that, that if we sit down to call them all out, it's going to be very difficult for us to have every user group which is actually discussed or touched on. But when you talk about them at this broad base, we actually can talk about different kinds of user groups. Now I'm going to flip the question. So what I'd like you to think about is, I'd like you to think about your own teams, right? We all work in accessibility, right? Every one of us, more or less. And how many of us have team members that fall into these groups, right? So we've got about 11, I think. Or is it 9? 9, sorry. How many of you have people who have at least people in 2 of the groups? 1, 2, 3, 4, a couple of more coming in. About 20% or maybe 15% of the room has people who have 2 or more. How many people have nobody in their group, in their team? We've got quite a few people. Nearly 40% of the room doesn't have anybody of this group set within their team. that, I think, is one of the challenges that you've got. So when I started off, I think I started the company in 2004. And before that, I went to the US and I met all of these fabulous friends and colleagues all around the world. And one of the first things I realized was that they all turned around and said, we work in accessibility, but when we started to talk about the people, we couldn't see enough people within their groups or within their teams. And everybody had this focus, which was of a user tester, which is a fabulous focus because that's the people who are going to use the product. They're not the person who is the accessibility guy who knows how to make something accessible, right? But I think there's a clear distinction between having people as testers and people with disabilities as accessibility experts, because those people live and breathe those products. So how many of you have used VoiceOver out here? Oh, everybody. How many of you are good at it? Okay. How many of you listen to it? Okay, not bad. I have a challenge for you. Find a visually impaired person, have them, sit down with them, listen to the same voice-over conversation at the same time, and let's see who gets all of the words of what the screen reader says, right? I can guarantee you most of us skim our screen reader, like we skim a page for heading structure, right? We skim it because it is not our primary tool. We're not dependent on it. We're yet going to use our site, or we're going to use our alternative sense to get a better understanding of things. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got is we can all be accessibility testers and use these tools, but we are not native users of these tools because these disabilities are not native to us, right? And as much as we would like it to be, there is a slight distinction. So I know I'm talking about a very radical thing in a room that believes in exactly the opposite of what I'm saying, more or less, as an industry, right? But I think there is merit. So consider hiring people on your teams from different diverse groups, right? Go out and make that effort. You will find it's so amazing that when all of these different groups come together, the organization just feels different. And I can say that because I have 200 people, and out of them, 70% of them have a disability. And we have people with all diverse groups that work with us. They might not be perfect, but they come together to give us a story and an understanding of disability, which is very rare around the world. Okay, so we've got all of those fabulous user groups. But now what do we do with it, right? Firstly, let's put the people first. And I'm going to talk about people. I've already spoken about it from a team's perspective. I'm going to talk about it from a couple of different perspectives. Experience how people access it, right? Access whatever it is that they access. It's amazing to actually see somebody just sit in the back, not tell them that they are testing something, and just see people walk around and the way you observe how they interact with the world and the way that they actually take on using technology. So we did this very simple example a couple of months back. We went to the airport. This is actually New York. And we sat outside a kiosk. And we were actually three of us, two of my other, not even friends or partners, actually competitors in the US market. And we just sat outside a kiosk. And we just sat and observed people using the kiosk, right? There were elderly people, there were people with low vision. There wasn't a single person who was blind who went to the kiosk to use the kiosk, right? They all went to the disability support desk of the airline, but they didn't go to the kiosk. So we had to take our understanding from the elderly group, which was often low vision, and was squinting, increasing the size of their eyes, moving their specs up and down, trying to focus on the words and get a clearer picture of it. And when you start to observe people, you start to learn a lot from them, right? And very often, we just jump to the technicality of it. We jump to the tool. We jump to that amazing product that we've seen, which is great. We jump to the code. but we forget that the people are there who actually use those solutions. So how many of you have had this experience where you've actually said, so take a customer of mine last week. So we sent out a PDF that was remediated and that was tested with visually impaired people. And it was a tagged PDF and it was fully accessible. And this customer of ours wrote back and said, but you know, I am trying to do this and this is not working. So we actually asked him how he was going to be using the PDF. And interestingly, he was going in a PDF, right arrow, right arrow, right arrow, right arrow, and left arrow. Whereas the best way to read a PDF is really down arrow, if you really want to go. He had never actually experienced a visually impaired person using a PDF. And he was trying to do a screen reader test himself, right? He was asking for keystrokes that will help him understand how a screen reader works, right? But he had no clue that one of the first things most people would do is use the heading structure and go through the entire PDF to see what they wanted to read, or go to the bookmarks and look at it from there, right? But the choices are multiple. So a very simple example of choice is how do we save in Microsoft Word, for example? We have the Save button, we have the Control S, we have the Save As. We can close a file and it will prompt us to save. Today we have autosave, and there are so many different ways of doing the same thing, right? If you are not a native user of a tool, by default, you are looking at a cheat sheet using keystrokes because you're not the primary user of that product. So I'd really recommend find people around you. Find people who are good at that. Not only will you add them to your teams, you'll also help build employment. You will also help build an equal society and an equal mindset and a diverse team. So I think put the people first and experience how people access it. Now, when it comes to including people as a part of the process, yesterday I was thrilled to see the project by IBM when they talked about tactile wireframing. Now, that was so, so cool. The question is, how many of us are willing to go out and actually look at that? And how many of the people are actually willing to look at making their own spaces or their own products accessible to that level, right? So I really urge you, look at it. It doesn't take very much. Like for them, it was about going to an art store and coming back with a whole lot of products and trying to figure out how to put an entire wireframe together. The most interesting thing is, right, there are so many choices. So how many of you have used a tactile graph or a tactile map before or experienced it? One, two, okay, three, obviously. So about 5% of the room. I'd urge you to go look for those things, right? We start off with technology, we forget that there are basics in how people interact with the world. And we need to know all of those different techniques. And we need to then adapt them, keeping our technical expertise in mind, right? So I'd really urge you to look at that. And I don't only mean from that. So when you're looking at, yesterday, Colin was talking about the deaf community. And in India, we run something called Newshook. It's a news website. I urge you to go and see it. It's quite interesting. We started it because we went and approached every news agency in India and asked them to make their websites accessible. And the one answer we got from every one of them is, news is not read by disabled people. Right. And it was amazing. So I had a venture capitalist who actually challenged me and said, Shilpi, you've knocked on everybody's doors, you've failed. The only way you can do this is start a news agency yourself, right? And we went on to start the first ever sign language deaf newsroom in the world, right? And we actually have deaf reporters that report for us. We have journalists that write stories, and we write about the voices of people with disabilities because nobody else wants to cover them, or they want to cover a story a week, more out of sympathy rather than, wow, these guys are fabulous, right? So can you shift the paradigm is the way that I would look at accessibility per se. And that's how the people approach starts to shift. So the people first approach, who do I add to my team, right? What all can they contribute? What different areas would you work on? And it's amazing to see that there are actually zero limitations. And all of those biases that we have in our heads, that if we hire a visually impaired person, they won't be able to look at wireframes, they won't be able to do a design review, they might not be able to help us with this, but just add a little bit of support, right? So we have this word that we use inside Barrier Break. So we have, every team of ours comprises of 2 people, right? We have what we call a functional accessibility tester, and we have something called an assistive technology accessibility tester. And that's the way we've clubbed them. Assistive technology because, based on whatever we are working on, the kind of user group of people that we put in shifts. So we might have a low vision person, we might have a person without vision, we might have a deaf person, we might have an autistic person. So they become our assistive technology accessibility testers. And these are not just users. These are actually accessibility knowledgeable people at different levels of accessibility. Somebody starting off, but somebody who has as much as 15 years of experience being an accessibility tester, but have a disability. On the other side, we have a functional tester. The functional tester is often the person who will not have the same disability as the assistive technology tester, might have a different one for all that matters, or might be, quote unquote, for a want of another way of saying it, somebody without a disability, right? Together they work to put together a test case and a test summary. And what we find is we get the maximum conversation out there. And I'll tell you why. So you've been given this fabulous retail website to test, right? And as an assistive technology tester, you start at the top and you come to the navigation invariably. And amazing, this company has just started looking at accessibility. And lo and behold, the navigation is surely not accessible, and I can't get into a menu. An assistive technology tester using a screen reader just bypasses that because they don't even know there's a menu out there. Obviously, it didn't come up for them. They bypassed it. Would they find it in the test run? No, they couldn't, because the screen reader didn't tell them anything. It just told them a word like product or service, and they skipped it, right? But now you have somebody who's a functional tester, and when they look at it, they say, oh God, here is a drop-down menu. And they go to their counterpart and say, hey, did you get it? And they say, oh, was there a drop-down menu? And invariably the person says, oh, I didn't get it. So, oh, no wonder it's not in your test run. And both of them are seeing each other's reports. And finally, there's a consolidation that gives you the actual finding, right? I know it feels like a lot of effort, but believe me, the kind of understanding you get and the kind of communication you get and the kind of awareness the way you understand how users use those systems, your whole perspective shifts, right? And that shift is what we all really need to start to see. So I would really recommend that each of you start to think about every one of those user groups. You start to think about how much is it that you want to do? How far do you want to go, right? So I would really request that think about that. If you can't have people full-time, bring in people part-time, bring in people for a couple of hours a week. Like we have this really interesting strategy that I'm going to talk about. I seem to have talked about most of this. When we actually think about it, you need to start including people in every stage. And when I mean people with disability, not disability, etc. So if you notice, I've stopped using the word people with disabilities as I go along, right? So include them in your product team, include them in your process, include them in your test run, include them in everything. So here's a very interesting statement that I use very often. So accessibility testing is a great experience, right, for different people with varying capabilities, different tools, different devices, right? So different people, not just you and me, different groups, different tools, different devices, right? So what's interesting is the moment you do that mix, it becomes a whole new ballgame. And then the question that comes up is, but how do I do that? There are so many diverse groups. There are so many tools. There are so many devices. I'm never going to make this happen. And most of my customers turn around and say this. So here's a very short introduction to two of the strategies that we talk about. The first strategy I'm going to talk about is 60, 20, 10, 10. Right? So what do you think is 60? Without vision and with limited vision. That's your 60% of your group, because sadly, nearly 100% of, or maybe 85% of WCAG is visual impairment, right? But if you take people in that segment, which is 60, you've got a winner. If you take the 20, right, and interestingly, the 20 that we use is we use people with learning impairment or cognitive challenges, right? The reason we do that is because yesterday, I think somebody was talking about content design. How do you simplify content design? We find the maximum effectiveness when we have people who have a different way of looking at the same content and how they look at it. So if you add them, so they bring in tools like dyslexia tools, reading tools, read out louds, options like that. Whereas the first group brings in screen readers, magnifiers, braille displayers, all of that, because that is their native device. The 10% is the deaf population, right? So bring in somebody who can then look at your videos, can even look at your content and say, oh my God, this is too much English for us, right? Can you do this in an alternative format, right? And the last 10% is something that very few people would like to touch, I think, which is mobility impaired. Because everybody just assumes that just doing a keyboard test means everything will work for everybody, right? But things like switch access are reality. Yesterday, somebody was talking about switch access. If you don't have a switch, don't worry. Just convert your keyboard into a switch. One key press, set a particular button or a character, and that becomes your switch. You don't even have to go and procure a switch. So I think the 60, 20, 10, 10 option gives you a fabulous split to work with. And lastly, design to launch, right? I think this is something that every one of us talks about, but every one of us does not get customers who are willing to come in and do this. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I would really urge you, when you start off with customers or you start off with your own teams, what you'll start to see is first you'll get products which will be right at their final delivery point, and you're suddenly rushing to meet a deadline for delivery because there's already a date announced. And soon you'll start to find them come in a little earlier, and a little more interaction with them will tell them that, oh, why don't you bring us in when you're doing the components build? Why don't you bring us in when you're coming to the wireframe? So bring them in earlier and earlier into the process by egging them along, not by pushing it their way and saying, this is the only way that you're going to do this, right? And with that, I think I'm going to stop because Sarah is giving me a timeout. So you can reach me at shilpi@barrierbreak.com. I'm on Twitter at Shilpi_Kapoor. And would love to meet all of you. And this is my first time in Australia, so would love to get to know more people. Thank you.